I'm Rob Johnson, Executive Director of the Mass Land Trust Coalition. I want to welcome you to the third in our series of pre-conference seminars that are offered by our top sponsors for the Mass Land Trust Conservation Conference. I just wanted folks to know that the conference is at capacity. So if you haven't registered yet, you have a limited number of days to add yourself to the wait list, and we'll see what we can do about letting people off the wait list. We're going to close the wait list completely on Friday. And it's great the conference is popular. We're really sad that we can't accommodate everybody who wants to join it, though. But today is about something else, which is about talking about Mass Audubon's 30 by 30 Catalyst Fund. So I want to turn it over to them, and they will introduce themselves, and we'll encourage you to put questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to address those by the end. All right, take it away, Jocelyn and David.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Hi, everyone. Happy, beautiful-ish spring March day. I'm Jocelyn Forbush. I'm the Chief Conservation Officer for Mass Audubon, and I'm here with you today with my colleague, David Santomenna. David, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, you bet. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Jocelyn and Rob and Barbara. Great to see everyone. I see many familiar faces in the crowd, so great to see everybody.
So we want to talk with you today about our 30 by 30 efforts here in Massachusetts, and in support of that, the 30 by 30 Catalyst Fund, which is a private fund for conservation here in Massachusetts. So Mass Audubon has just launched this in June of last year, the fund. And so today is a little bit of an opportunity both for us to give you context on what is this thing, and how are we thinking about 30 by 30? How might we all think about a 30 by 30 goal, regardless of what's happening at the federal landscape, and how we might work together going forward. But give you a little bit of background as we start out. I'll just give you a little context of sort of why this 30 by 30 initiative and the fund sits as a real priority for Mass Audubon. This is a map essentially of Mass Audubon's action agenda. It's our essentially our strategic plan stretching out through 2026. And as you can imagine, the benefits of land protection sit really strongly in all three of the goals that define our action agenda, which are really focused on the three challenges that we see of the moment: really incredible biodiversity loss, climate change, and also the inequitable access to nature. So we're really looking at a 30 by 30 initiative in land conservation as a really critical solution. And we'll talk a little bit more about why and what all that is. To zoom way out, for those of you who aren't familiar with what this 30 by 30 strategy and this language is that I'm tossing around, it is essentially a global biodiversity framework that was set forward at COP15. This was in 2022. So it was really an international effort to focus on biodiversity loss, but also recognizing the importance of mitigating and adapting to climate change, and also with a real eye to the inclusion of local communities. And so again, this is international, and in 2022 and since then, over 190 countries that adopted it, including the US with the Biden administration. Interestingly, a significant number of states within the US adopted 30 by 30 goals in and of themselves. So you think of California, New York, Maine, Vermont, Maryland, all taking on this challenge to protect 30% of their states by 2030. So we looked at this opportunity in Massachusetts really around that same time. It was acknowledged in the Clean Energy and Climate Plan as a critical strategy to getting to our 2050 goals in Massachusetts. And right, in particular, looking at it from a climate aspect, the idea that our natural and working lands offset roughly 10% on an annual basis of our emissions, and they're really important in the carbon calculation for Massachusetts to get to its clean energy and climate goals by 2050. When it was initiated in Massachusetts, or when first named in Massachusetts, we had about 27% of our land protected in 2022. By the time we got to 2025, this year, we're up closer to around 28%. I'll get into counting, or we can get into how we count and what all that means later on, but this is of course an estimate. And the goal by 2030 was to achieve 100,000 acres. So this is if we were in 2022. So we knew we had a roughly 100,000 acre goal. A really important side note is that this isn't only about 2030, this is really about the 2050 target, right? Again, the Clean Energy and Climate Plan is really focusing Massachusetts on 2050. And the idea is to get to 30 by 30, but also 40% of Massachusetts protected by 2050. So the idea that we're accelerating our energy and our focus on land protection to get to 2030, you could think almost of it as a warm-up on getting to 40% protected by 2050. Those of you who have read the Forest as Climate Solutions report, which was put out in 2024, will have read the resonance of this 30 by 30 plan. It was noted in there, the real focus there of keeping forests as forests being critical, and conservation of those forests being a key tool and approach in doing so. And then also in the executive order that was put together or put forward in 2023, that set also some goals and reiterated these goals for 2030, 2040, and 2050. So that was really that executive order when this came out of the climate space for Massachusetts and really considered the 30 by 30 and 40 by 50 goals in a biodiversity context, and the idea that not only are we protecting these lands for carbon and for climate mitigation, but we're also really looking at them from a biodiversity perspective as well. Many of you have seen a map like this. I just wanted to share it because, again, it's really important for us to be zooming out and looking well beyond our borders in Massachusetts to see what are we part of as a system. And of course, this is a map of above ground woody biomass. This is essentially an above ground forest map. And what it shows here in the US, we have an extraordinary forested landscape here on the eastern part of the country. Also an extraordinary sink over there source on the west coast. But really important for Massachusetts is to be thinking of itself as part, of course, this Appalachian corridor, which so many organizations are talking about, and our role in Massachusetts of protecting some of the richest carbon and forested landscapes, not just in New England, not just in the country, but really in the world. This is an extraordinarily significant landscape and really important for us to contribute to this large complex of natural, largely forested systems. So there's some national context for you as well. So where are we now in Massachusetts on our way to protecting 30% of Massachusetts by 2030? 4.99, so roughly 5 million acres of land in the state. Roughly 1.4 million acres permanently protected, so we're just over 28% in protection. And so we are essentially calculating that at about an 89,000 acre gap to achieve our 30% of lands protected in the state. Next slide. And so what does that mean for what we need to do? We know that if we're going to get to at least 30 by 30, not to mention 40 by 50, we are needing to double our pace of land protection. Our current pace at about 10,000 acres per year really needs to go to closer to 20,000 acres per year. We know we need to continue to expand the really good collaborations, partnerships, planning, and that we already have underway that has so much mobilized our conservation community to achieve over 28% already. So we need to really keep this going. And of course, there's even much more engagement of our Indigenous communities here in Massachusetts and in the region in this work, which is exceptionally important. And then core to this work, and much of what we're going to talk about today, is the need to really increase funding for conservation. So we will soon come out with a report, and I hope in the next couple of weeks that it really talks about what will it cost for us to get to 30 by 30 and what will it require of us as a community looking for funding and generating funding. And we know that at minimum, when you take into account the existing funding from public sources, we essentially need roughly a minimum of $200 million a year in new public funding annually to get to 30 by 30, and that number stays at least consistent as you look to 40 by 50, if not increasing as, of course, land values and costs escalate. So that's a significant new source, set of sources of funding that we'll need to actually satisfy that. And of course, we need to continue to engage, galvanize private sector support for this work. This is where Mass Audubon set up this 30 by 30 Catalyst Fund. As I mentioned, we kicked it off last June. At that point, we set a goal of $75 million as far as what a private source for conservation, specifically targeting projects that are leading us to a 30 by 30 vision. And what does that vision look like? And what is this framework? It's essentially building this framework around the core elements of the international and the national 30 by 30 focus. So protecting biodiversity, protecting critical carbon, both the opportunity to store it and to sequester it. So the goals that Mass Audubon set for its Catalyst Fund is, we've note right here, we sort of looked at, well, what if we protect 30% of Massachusetts by 2030? And we really focus that protection on our highest biodiversity and highest carbon lands, highest opportunity to protect carbon. What does that yield us potentially? And here we have a number of sort of acre goals around biodiversity, particularly mapped by our really important and beautiful biomap data layers. And also we did a calculation around the tons of carbon that would be stored or sequestered in between now and 2050. This is, of course, an estimate, and David will talk a little bit about the source of this data, but of course, many of you may know the Harvard Forest data layer that Jonathan Thompson did as far as modeling carbon in our Massachusetts forests. That is the source for that figure. So these are our targets. That set of 100,000 acres should yield those particular outcomes for both biodiversity and carbon. So we're thinking a lot about the funding here and how do we make this happen, recognizing that there are a number of limitations for getting between here and 2030 and achieving this 30% protection goal, but a core one among them is the funding. Private funding, I've talked about, and this is where we've initiated our Catalyst Fund. And that's a $75 million number. That, of course, as you note, when I said we'll need about $200 million, we think, a year in additional funding. That $75 million, of course, is going towards that. It doesn't solve that whole issue. And so if you look here at the far right, we have this TBD, new dedicated source of funding. And I think many of you have heard about the Nature for Massachusetts campaign. This is the effort by Mass Audubon and really so many in our community to establish a new dedicated source of funding, either through legislative action or through a ballot initiative. If you've attended any of those conversations, you'll know that the goal, I think right now, is roughly to have that source yield about $100 million a year for conservation and other nature-based needs in Massachusetts. So that would go a long way in helping us fuel this effort, matching existing municipal contributions in the form of programs like MVP or CPA program, state and federal dollars. And then, of course, I mentioned the private contributions that so many of our land trusts and their supporters are making to every project that we're doing. Next slide. Yeah, this is where I can hand this over to David Santomenna, because I think, I think what will be fun is to get into the nuts and bolts of the Catalyst Fund, sort of how we designed it and how we thought about setting up the allocation of funding and how we're focusing on prioritization of these landscapes that help us get us to those goals that I mentioned a few slides ago. So David, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jocelyn. Yeah, so I'm going to run sort of through an overview of the program and some of the criteria that we're applying and some of the methodology, and then get into some sort of project case studies. I just want to acknowledge up front that there are many folks on this call who are deeply familiar with a lot of these projects, so just want to acknowledge that up front. And it's great to have everybody, everyone with us this afternoon. So some of the key elements of the fund design are the funds are broadly available to both nonprofit entities, municipalities, and state and federal agencies. So we're really trying to feed all of the different sources of land conservation projects that we have here in the state. To be really clear, the Catalyst Fund is not a grant program. We don't have an application per se. We don't have deadlines per se. We really view it as an opportunity for project proponents to work closely with Mass Audubon's very able land conservation team to sort of envision and structure and design these projects, sort of incorporating hopefully the Catalyst Fund funds early on, so they're sort of an integral part of the project design. And I think that it's an efficient and collaborative approach, we hope. And the macro level funding determinations are really built on three things. There's a very significant focus on resource prioritization, and I'm going to drill down a little bit into what exactly we mean by that. We, as do many other funders, have goals around leverage, and our overall goal is to see about one Catalyst Fund dollar leverage $3 additional in our projects. And I would hasten to note that we know that not all projects are gonna hit that threshold, but our experience to date is that there are projects that don't quite get there, but there are many projects that far exceed that. So on balance, we're shooting for that sort of 3-to-1 leverage, and that's, I mean, as many folks will know, that's just an effort to stretch the dollars as far as we can, maximize impact, and move towards those 30-30 goals as efficiently as possible. And then there are a suite of additional project benefits that we take into consideration as well, and I'll go through those in more detail. Those are a little bit more difficult to quantify. So those are sort of more the imponderables, if you will. So there are, it's intended to be a very flexible tool. So there are a number of different ways that project proponents can tap into the Catalyst Fund, including what we're calling here project startup and support, which could be due diligence around appraisal. It could be some initial title work. It could even be an investment in a deposit for an option agreement or a purchase and sales contract. We are putting funds directly into purchases of both the interest and conservation restrictions. Those are, again, project contributions. And again, that's really where the leverage factor comes most into play and most clearly. So sometimes we're the early money, and hopefully that's building momentum around capital for a project, and sometimes we could be the last money in, closing that last gap. So there are a variety of ways to sort of think about how to tap into Catalyst Fund contributions for purchases. We do have the ability to do loans, and one of the projects I'm going to profile in a moment is a sort of hybrid loan and contribution project. We now have a formal loan policy in place here at Mass Audubon. To date, we've been doing them on a little bit of an ad hoc basis, but we do now have guidance around our loans. And then pre-acquisitions have been a really important part of the overall Catalyst Fund portfolio. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Winchester Forest project, which again, many folks have heard about. I see Sarah's smiling there. So, but also pre-acquisitions are supporting a lot of the the Kestrel Go Big work as well. So again, a lot of different ways to plug Catalyst Fund dollars into projects. And the way that we're, again, quantifying sort of the resource prioritization, there's a heavy emphasis, as Jocelyn indicated, on biodiversity and carbon. And we're drawing heavily on a variety of different biomap core layers, forest, rare species, aquatic, etc. Again, those are the ones that we think bear most directly on biodiversity. Again, this is the first time that Mass Audubon anyway has explicitly included a carbon criteria in a co-occurrence model. So again, we're tapping into the Harvard Forest data for 2025 and 2050. And again, those are sort of equally weighted between biodiversity and carbon. We are putting these projects in a broader context and working through connectivity and to get at that, we're again using the biomap critical natural landscape blocks and also the regional connectivity. So again, getting at that swath of deep green that was in the map that Jocelyn showed. And then we are including a criteria around parcel size, all else being equal. And in the interest of getting to those aggressive goals, we're trying to emphasize larger projects where we can, acknowledging that sometimes there are, very important projects that just fit a specific piece in the puzzle. And we want to be able to include those as well. And then the suite of additional criteria that I reference is pretty broad, but front and center are connections to environmental justice communities, incorporation of the indigenous community and sort of project design involvement, etc. Sort of a broad set of other natural resource-based criteria. Again, drinking water supply, flood mitigation. For Audubon, important bird areas are kind of a hot button, and then ACECs as well. And again, there's no numerical criteria to that. This is just additional things that can be put into the mix as we sort of evaluate projects. Where public access is a logical part of project design, we're encouraging of that, and we are trying to be responsive to threat really, and trying to head off those developments that would have the most deleterious effects on the things we're trying to protect. And so that's where sort of the urgency and timeliness consideration comes in. And then there's sort of an overall, sort of project design test. And hopefully sort of the early involvement of the Audubon team in these projects is sort of addressing questions around feasibility and likelihood of success at the outset. So by the time something gets sort of through the process, we've pretty well thrashed out those issues. So the Catalyst Fund as currently designed and in operation is specific to the 4 western counties in the state. Sorry, 5 western counties in the state. I would note that we have not forgotten about the coast. Coast is very important to us here at Mass Audubon. We are in, I would say, the latter stages of designing an analogous model for the coast, and obviously it's a very different and dynamic system in the coast. So we're adding some other layers into that analysis, and expect to have that in place within the next few weeks, and to be rolling out a coastal component of the Catalyst Fund. So fear not, folks who are in the eastern part of the state. So jumping into some projects, again, this is a completed project, the Hawes Hill Conservation Corridor. This was a really great collaboration with the folks at Mount Grace, as well as the town of Barrie, DCR, et cetera, at a very significant scale. So 815 acres was the final acreage. So again, we had, state, nonprofit at the regional and statewide levels, municipal partners, and East Quabbin, as well as Mount Grace on the nonprofit side. a little bit of a unique project in the sense that it was designed from the outset to be kind of all conservation restriction. And that was in response sort of to the local political dynamics to a significant extent, and also just being mindful of sort of stewardship obligations. You take on that amount of acreage, those are potentially really big stewardship obligations if you're talking about land and fee. And we were fortunate in this instance to get a landscape partnership grant. It covered not quite half of the project. We had great support from other philanthropic sources, and this was one where sort of the Catalyst Fund came in towards the end and filled the remaining funding gap after we tapped all those other sources. Just for fun, this is the geography, and so in red and kind of mustard are the project parcels, and you can see really filling in some key gaps, some connective tissue in that protected landscape. And this is Mass Audubon's Rutland Brook Sanctuary. So again, we didn't add any land and fee to the sanctuary, but we do feel like we added very significantly to the resilience of that landscape. And this just gives you a flavor for sort of the biomap overlays. This piece was really key from a water supply protection perspective. So that's where the DCR water supply folks came in. A completed project, and I referenced this earlier, in Mendon, and this is a collaboration with the Metacomet Land Trust and the town of Mendon. This is project is called Maple Farm. And again, at 115 acres in that part of the state, that's a pretty significant piece of land. So we actually had, as I said, two different components of the action, if you will, on this project. So we made a $200,000 contribution towards this. In this case, this was a conservation restriction purchase, funded through a local CPA commitment, as well as a conservation partnership grant from the state. Just to give a flavor for how the model works, this was an 80 to 90th percentile catalyst score. Again, fortunate to have sort of 7-to-1 leverage here. So this is sort of, again, exceeding that 3-to-1 goal that we have. And this is a part of the state that, private philanthropy is a little bit challenging in this geography. So the combination of CPA, Catalyst, and state was able to fill the gap here. And the loan we were really happy to do, that is an acknowledgement that, as folks know, virtually all of our state loans are on a reimbursement basis, and that can be a challenge for smaller organizations. And so in this instance, we did step in to bridge the $175,000 grant from the state so that everyone could close, and then the reimbursement would flow and we would be repaid. And that's exactly, happily, how it works. This is a project that's underway and slated to close again by the end of this fiscal year. This is a Mass Audubon project. This is adjacent to our Pierpont Meadows Sanctuary in Oxford and Dudley. From the sanctuary perspective, this is a really significant acquisition. It about doubles the size of our protected land in that area. Again, you can see, very strong in our Catalyst rankings. Again, in this, going back a second, in this instance, we have a conservation partnership grant from the state. So thanks to the good folks at DCS for that. And we're actively fundraising, but knowing that we have the Catalyst Fund sort of in place really helps us move forward with confidence on this kind of thing. So excited to be able to expand that sanctuary pretty significantly. So mentioned in forest, I can't do a presentation these days without talking about this project. It was kind of all consuming, not just for Mass Audubon, but for many other folks as well. But the overlay is that this is about a 1,300 acre assemblage of had been family owned timberland, was at imminent risk of development as a utility scale solar project, is in a geography that has seen a lot of investment of open space funds from from NGOs and the state and the municipalities. And the prospect of losing this really key holding to solar was very troubling to folks. And we were able to respond. It took a fair amount of coordination. We needed 2 different towns to agree to assign their right of first refusal. But the fact that we were able to go to those boards of selectmen and say with confidence that if they saw fit to assign their rights, we would be in a position to complete the transaction. So that really created a really sort of positive dynamic, and a pathway for where the towns could feel comfortable doing that. So all that happened. Both Winchendon and Ashburnham voted. We own the property, courtesy of the Catalyst Fund, and we're working towards closing with DCR and DFG by the end of this fiscal year. And this is the Winchendon snapshot from the Winchendon public hearing. I don't know if you can see it, but this meeting started at 7 p.m. and it's 9:50 at this point. So this is 3 solid hours of a packed to the gills, standing room only, Winchendon Town Hall. And just as the selectmen were making their unanimous vote to assign their rights to Mass Audubon. And then lastly, this is a current project and really at a scale that's very impressive. And again, many folks in this call are very engaged in this, so I won't spend a ton of time on it. And we're going to have a good amount of time for Q&A afterwards. But this is the Connecticut River Watershed Forest project that Kestrel really kicked off nearly 2 years ago at this point. So you can see a very broad swath of the state along the Connecticut River is sort of the focus area. Very broad participation by the nonprofit community and by the agencies, both state and federal. At the end of the day, there was outreach to about 500 plus forest landowners. Almost all those ownerships were in excess of 100 acres and had very high proportions of forest cover and biomap. So there was sort of a natural overlap between the criteria that this initiative was applying and by the criteria that we have adopted for the Catalyst Fund. At the end of the day, the collective we had 46 individual landowners that were interested and willing to sign a letter and be part of a forest legacy application. So that's nearly a 10% sort of acquisition rate, if you will, to use sort of the direct mail lingo, which is phenomenal. Like you never see that. If it's 1, 2, 5, you think you've hit it out of the park. So the fact that nearly 10% did really speaks to the effectiveness of the outreach. And also I think that an awful lot of work went into sort of matching the conservation ambassador to the landowner. And so there were many meetings to try and figure out who would be the most appropriate contact for a specific landowner. And so so where things stand at the moment, just so folks know, is that the forest legacy application was submitted last fall. We are not really all that clear on where things stand with that program going forward. So we're in, as with many federal programs, a little bit of a state of limbo on that. In the meantime, we are pressing forward with our plan to pre-acquire as many of the fee properties as we can, and we've actually had very good success in reaching agreements with landowners, and have 10 or 12 separate parcels that at this point either formally under agreement or with agreements under negotiation. And the expectation is that probably by the end of this fiscal year, most of those we will own, pending maybe a forest legacy grant or maybe another set of funding sources to be determined. So there's a quick sprint through some of the different ways that Catalyst funds can go into projects. And Jocelyn, you want to take us home? You're on mute.
Apologies. The last few thoughts on sort of where are we now? I mentioned our June kickoff. It's only been a few months, so we're learning quite a bit about what it means to set up a fund like this, how we can best partner with the conservation community broadly. We're also in the process of looking at that model, the analytical model that David walked you through. So we're in a great spot to kind of look back over a few months, assess what's going well and what do we need to tweak. But in the meantime, we're also trying to get these sort of dashboards and outcome measurements on what's progress so far. So we're just over 6,000 acres protected, and we are making some calculations. I set up front that we have a set of targets, particularly around biomap and around carbon. So you see here our sort of thermometer approach in presentation to what the 6,400 acres represents as far as core habitat, critical natural landscape, and both stored and sequestration potential. We're also thinking about adding to this set of thermometers. We're thinking about how one expresses and measures the connectivity goals. As you all know, that's so critical. And it's also, as David mentioned, an important criteria in how we're thinking about both where Mass Audubon does its work, but also where the funds are invested. Head on to the next one. As far as what does it mean to get to a $75 million goal, so far we have raised just over 40 million in both contributions and commitments. And we have about 15 million of that 40 already in active projects, whether that's pre-acquisitions, whether that's purchases of CRs and easements, whether that's loans. So it's a whole constellation of ways, as David mentioned, that we're engaging, and it's about 15 million now. And we have a number of really great projects in the pipeline with partners. So we have a fund leverage, David said, I think with a 1 to 3 number, we've actually achieved a 1 to 9 leverage. This, of course, is across all projects that we've done across those 6,000 acres. So as far as the ability for this fund to leverage other dollars, in particular, in the last year or so, we've been looking at the public sources, some of those federal, many state, and then also other private contributions. We really are trying to use this fund as an inspiration and a motivator, and also, of course, the last mile for closing out a project if needed. And so that's really, really great to see this essentially constellation of funding sources. This has also inspired about $34 million in additional public sources. So we're not counting, when we're raising funds from public sources, they're not counting towards that 40 million of our $75 million goal. And that 34 million, many of you know, of the RCPP project, $25 million commitment to particularly the Connecticut River watershed in Massachusetts, that is actually still live and chugging forward. And then an additional 9 million in the last 10 months that has been committed from public sources, a range of public sources, large and small. And a number that we really value and are excited about is this last note here, is the project partners and collaborators. As I said up front, as David reinforced, this is really a fund for conservation towards these goals. Of course, Mass Audubon projects, should we find ourselves in the place where we have potential deals with landowners of high biodiversity and high carbon properties, we're excited to move those forward ourselves, but we're also really excited to be working in some cases like the Kestrel-led project in Western Mass. It's just extremely creative, innovative ways of thinking about how are we accelerating this work together. So more of that to come for all of us as we move forward and get creative. A few thoughts on where we're headed looking ahead. So we are continuing to think about how can we lift our project pace and success. And that goes for Mass Audubon. We've already seen, I want to say, a 4-fold increase in our own conservation pace. And we're hoping to continue to see this with ourselves as a community. Again, trying to get from that 10,000 acres a year closer to the 20,000 acres a year that it will require for us to get not only to 30 by 30, but 40 by 50. I mentioned expanding partnerships. David noted the coastal mapping. I did note that we're happy to share in the MLTC newsletter when any new either changes or additions are coming through this fund. So the coastal mapping and the coastal analysis, I think in the next, I would say month and a half, we're in the midst of fine tuning. So we'd love to implement that with all of you. So stay tuned. I also included here an idea of addressing data management issues. This is something that we're talking with Rob and others about. Our data, our open space data layer in Massachusetts is often lagging significantly. And so though we're trying not to get hung up on like the counting issues amongst this, as we've seen actually some other states tie themselves into knots on exactly how many acres and exactly what percentage has been protected. We do know that we have always wanted to do better, and this could be a motivating force that helps us and work with the state to really get that open space data layer more accurately updated, more frequently updated. So we want to think about the capacity needed to make that happen. It would help us all. We're looking at continuing to develop and grow sources of public funding. This is, of course, a real question mark on the federal landscape currently. But from the perspective of Massachusetts, we're always looking at environmental bond. But of course, I mentioned that Nature for Massachusetts campaign, that last bullet there, which is really, I know, a whole coalition at this point of us in Massachusetts really trying to identify new source of public funding. And then we have additional funds to raise to get to that $75 million goal. So on our way, but still some significant fundraising ahead of us. And I think with that, next slide, David, I think we can thank you all for being here today with us and listening. I see a whole range of questions that maybe David's been able to dig into, and we can move to those, but I think we're very happy at this point to have conversation and hear thoughts and questions and see if there are ideas on how we can all be working together to move this goal forward in the state. So thanks all. And
David, do you want to moderate your questions yourself, or you just let me know if you'd like some help?
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
Okay.
I'll quickly respond to Robin on the Harvard Forest carbon calculator question. No. Harvard Forest does not have a calculator per se, so we just, we took their data and incorporated it into our model. So there's not a viewer for Harvard Forest. I mean, many other organizations have those, TNC, TPL, OSI. So there's a variety of ways to look at carbon that are out there, but you have to have a certain amount of GIS savvy to access the Harvard Forest data, unfortunately.
Sorry,
I think we can absolutely.
May I just ask a follow-up then?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. So how shall we come up with numbers for our proposals to discuss with you nice people?
Yeah, oh, sure, great question. And I should have
would you
addressed
do
this
that?
earlier.
For us.
We will be making the model available to folks. It'll be, password protected so it doesn't become completely open source. But we will be making that available. So you can go in and on a parcel by parcel basis, play around with it and see how things are shaking out. We actually having 6 or 8 months of experience under our collective belts. We're actually taking another look at the model. Maybe we're going to tweak it a little bit to make sure that we're getting out of it what we think we're getting out of it. Once that's done, we'll circulate that link.
I'll take on, Brian, your question. I think we'd be happy to share the outreach letter that worked so well in the Connecticut River Valley. I don't know exactly how we might share that, but I know we're happy to do that so we can follow up with you specifically. And if anyone else would like that, I thought I saw Lee Halatz from Kestrel on this call, but we can check with them and make sure that's fine to circulate. And I think the other piece that David mentions really important around the success of that outreach is that it really was really the group of partners, both state and private land trust sitting around the table going through, I think it was like 1,300 initially, a list of landowners, and sort of culling that on the highest potential, and then each land trust identifying who they had connections with already, who they've had conversations with in the past. And then those land trusts essentially were the ones assigned for that outreach. So it wasn't just blanket sort of cold call letters, hopefully, right? So putting notes on some of that outreach to, right, maybe a landowner that someone had talked to 5 years ago. So it was a relatively nuanced approach. So I think happy to share the letter, but in doing so, we should also happy to talk, and I know others in that consortium would be happy to talk about how that work flowed. And then I see the question around Middlesex County, and I, of course, when people are looking at the map and they see our 5 western counties mapped already, and we're talking about the coast, the intention is to really look at this across the whole state. Ultimately, we started with the western 5 counties, particularly knowing that that was the highest and clearest, also least expensive geography, and largest landscape blocks. So from a sort of an impact, an acceleratory effort, we focus there. But we are, I think, slowly but surely going to be applying this model across the state, recognizing that just, between the 5 counties of central and western Mass and the coast, there are some really important landscapes as well. It's just taking us a little bit of time, and we're sequencing the analysis, knowing we can't apply, when we apply the model that we created for central and western Mass, it really doesn't look that great on the coast, and the coastal model doesn't look really great in the interior geography. So we're trying to be thoughtful in identifying this and addressing the specific nuances of these sort of large geographies. So that's really a stay tuned, I would say, more than anything.
Yeah. And I can take Garrett's question about land and CR donations. In terms of the interest that's being acquired, and the fund's pretty agnostic whether that's a fee interest or whether that's a restriction of some sort. So it can apply to any of those. I would say that, if there are landowners that are interested in making donations, but an impediment is some land planning or some appraisal work or conservation restriction endowment or something, those are things that the Catalyst Fund can be applied to. So it doesn't just have to go to projects where there's a big purchase. It can also be applied to projects where there's some philanthropic intent, and you just need a little bit of funding to kickstart the thing. So hopefully we're able to address, again, those generational shifts by having a variety of different tools available.
And David, you see Elaine has her hand up.
I do see Elaine has her hand up.
So 2 questions. One is assuming that sound forest management of land with the forest management plan is still very acceptable within the your goals of carbon sequestration and biodiversity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not taking a totally hands-off perspective on this. So, I mean, that's the right answer in some cases, but not in all, and not for all landowners. So yeah, that's certainly fair game.
Okay, and I guess the other question is part of the matching. If folks were to donate, do a bargain sale, is that match count towards that financing?
It would. Yep, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you.
Garrett, go ahead.
Garrett, yeah.
Yeah, I was actually thinking more of when you were calculating what sort of resources are needed to accomplish the 30 by 30 goal. Was that all based on acquiring all that land, conservation restrictions by buying it? Or did you have a certain percentage that you would expect to be donated?
No, we actually we're taking a little bit of a worst case scenario perspective there. and trying to figure out like the most that we would need. And there were, there were many, many variables that went into that, and it's probably still an undercount. I think the analysis that Jocelyn referenced is coming out in a few weeks' time. We'll get into that at a higher level of detail and probably with a lot more accuracy. The other thing I would just say is that, over time, we've seen the number of conservation gifts trend downward, right? And so we expect that to continue. So we didn't want to count on how many conservation donors are going to be out there in 2045, right? So,
I see.
Rob?
Oh,
Yeah, can I, I wanted to, two clarifying question and then a request for a little bit more detail. Jocelyn, I believe I gathered from what you were saying that the Catalyst Fund goal of 75 million is 75 million all in private dollars.
correct.
And then the other question, more clarifying, can you reference briefly the status of your $25 million RCPP grant? And I wonder if you could share a little bit more, because everybody's on pins and needles about all this federal money, and I'm just curious what the latest is on prospects for that flowing.
Yeah, sure. So yes, the 75 million is private. I will say we set that target before we actually did the more recent calculations that we're referencing that will be coming out in a document in the next month or so of how much it's actually going to cost, which is significant, right? I mentioned the $200 million minimum per year, but that's if you're looking at in essence the least expensive scenario, not counting Garrett, like the opportunity for millions and millions of dollars of donations, but as David said, worst case scenario. So it's 75 million in private, intended to really inspire any range of other private and public investments. The $25 million RCPP award is not counted in there currently because that's not a private source, and it's also the way NRCS works with its RCPP awards is they're essentially conditional is the wrong word, but you don't actually have the money when the announcement comes out. You go from that announcement through what is something like an 8 to 12 month negotiation period to set the framework and the contracts and the implementation plan for the project. So we are in the midst of that. So the $25 million grant that we have is focus on three areas. One is restoration. Well, first of all Connecticut River watershed in Massachusetts. So that's the catchment area. It's focused on restoration, particularly aquatic. So dam removal, floodplain forest restoration projects. It's also focused on land protection in that geography. All of that must be focused by the NRCS targets of habitat conservation, and we're largely saying this is going to be in forested landscapes, but it doesn't have to be exclusively for forests. So easement work, restoration work, and the third area is a partnership with the Lincoln Institute and a very cool entity within the Lincoln Institute, which is called the Center for Geospatial Studies, and we are working with them to create essentially a measurement approach, so not a model, but a measurement approach that is using geospatial technology for, in particular, carbon, above ground carbon. So we mentioned the Harvard Forest model. That is indeed a model. And so what we are looking at is trying to create a measurement tool for the deciduous forests of New England using the Connecticut River watershed in Massachusetts as the test site and the funding from RCBP as the source to do the work. And so Lincoln Institute is going to be working on that with that Center for Geospatial Studies and an entity called C, the letter C Trees. We'll also be looking at measuring designing sort of geospatial measurement tools for other attributes, water quality, biodiversity, et cetera. But the initiating concept was around carbon. So three elements there. We have a number of partners, Trout Unlimited, Connecticut River Conservancy on the land management side, Castrol Land Trust, Mount Grace Land Trust, East Quabbin, and then also Hilltown Land Trust are existing partners on the easement side. And if anyone has projects in this area in the state and they're really excited for them to get funded by this source, please reach out. It is not like some programs where you submit a set of parcels that are the subject and focus and they can't change. In this case, we can actually bring in new conservation and new restoration projects over the 5-year period. Last thing I'll say is we're in the middle of this roughly what I think is like an 8 to 12 month period of negotiations with NRCS. So we're busy learning NRCS languages and filling out forms and doing all the things that we need to do to get this set. And we imagine it would kick off into the fall. And it is it's Farm Bill funded, and I will underscore Farm Bill funded, which is partly why I think this is still a live source and a live grant, because that is a source in the federal government that I've seen so far that has not received a great deal of scrutiny. My understanding, and I don't know if Daria's on the call, but the state also had an RCPP submitted and awarded conditionally. That was IRA funding was the source. And I believe that and other RCPPs around the country with that source are, if not on hold, just not really clear of what will happen with them. So we're very fortunate and hopeful to try to wrangle some of these other federal dollars back from the brink, but we're in the same boat with all of you, sort of puzzling through how to do that.
I can quickly answer Stuart's question on the open space data layer. Yeah, we do not have a secret source of open space data that we're tapping into. So yes, we're looking to the state for that data as well. But would note that, there's discussion going on, and Rob is part of that as to if there are ways that we can help the state address some of their data backlog issues. And bring that data as current as possible. So
I don't know if you can address Amy's question there, either of you, about whether do you have a sense of whether the larger, the private foundation community, how they're being impacted by the shakeup at the federal level, and how that may be impacting your prospects for raising the balance of the Catalyst Fund target that you have?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't dare to speak for them. And as you know, they're all very different, the foundations and how they're going to approach this. And my sense is also that, like many of us, they're watching and trying to understand what's actually going on and what's being impacted, and still prioritizing and making their own assessments. That said, I've talked to a couple national foundations in particular who are really going on defense. So they're focused on like federal level LWCF funding defense and things like that. But I haven't seen a one size fits all. And I don't know if others want to chime in answer to Amy's questions if you know more, but I don't have a beat that's consistent across philanthropy.
Great. Well, we are just about at time. There's a couple of comments in the chat that don't require answers per se. Daria did update us on the state's RCPP award, and I put a link to the legislation that was referenced earlier in the session. So I guess we can thank Jocelyn and David so much for sharing all this information, and more than that, for the generous provision of this program for many partners to take advantage of. So excited to see all that will be achieved.
Yeah, thanks all. Thanks for the opportunity, and great to see you at the conference.
yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good afternoon.